The photograph fell off the wall the moment Grace Bennett stepped into the house, and she took it as a warning she should have listened to. She bent down to pick up the frame, and her hands went still when she saw the face staring back at her. A woman with soft brown curls and a bright smile, standing beside a much younger Ethan Cole on a beach somewhere sunny and far away. Grace had never seen this woman before, yet something about the way Ethan looked at her in the photo made her stomach twist. "You didn't tell me you kept pictures of her," Grace said, holding up the frame as Ethan carried the last box through the front door. Ethan froze. For a moment he looked like a man caught doing something he knew was wrong, and then his face settled into the calm, practiced expression Grace had learned to recognize over the past year. It was the face he wore whenever the subject of his past came too close to the surface. "That's just an old photo," he said, taking the frame from her hands gently, but firmly, like he was rescuing something fragile. "I forgot it was still up there." "You forgot," Grace repeated, watching him carry it toward a shelf, setting it down face first instead of putting it away entirely. "Ethan, we spent the whole week packing my apartment together. You had plenty of time to walk through this house and notice a framed photograph hanging on your own wall." "It's not a big deal," Ethan said, a little too quickly, already turning back toward the front door for the next box. "Let's just get everything inside before it starts raining." Grace let it go for the moment, following him back out to the car, though the exchange settled uneasily in her mind. She had spent the last 6 months falling for a man who seemed thoughtful about nearly everything, who noticed when she was tired before she said a word, who remembered exactly how she liked her eggs cooked after only being told once, a man that observant did not simply forget a photograph hanging at eye level in his own living room. Grace wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that moving into this house together meant they were finally starting something new, something that belonged only to the two of them. But as she looked around the living room, she noticed things she had missed during her first visits. A woman's handwriting on old birthday cards displayed on the bookshelf. A pair of earrings sitting untouched in a small dish on the side table, as if someone might come back for them any day. A perfume bottle, half full, resting on the windowsill like it was waiting to be used again. This was not a house that belonged only to Ethan. It belonged to a memory, too. "Ethan," Grace said carefully, "whose house did we just move into?" He didn't answer right away. He set the box down slowly, and when he finally looked at her, his eyes carried a weight she had not seen before. "Mine," he said. "It's been mine for 6 years. Then why does it feel like someone else still lives here?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck, a habit Grace recognized as his way of avoiding a conversation. "Her name was Claire," he said finally. "She was my fiancée. She died before we could get married." The words landed heavier than Grace expected. Grief was something she understood. Loss was something she could hold space for. But this felt different. This felt like walking into a marriage that had never officially ended. "I'm sorry," Grace said softly, and she meant it. "I didn't know." "It was a long time ago," Ethan said, though his voice did not sound like it was a long time ago at all. It sounded raw, like the wound had only just closed. Grace nodded, choosing to believe that this was simply the pain of an old loss, nothing more. She told herself that love meant patience, and patience meant giving Ethan the space to keep healing, even years later. She had no idea, not yet, how deep this house had been shaped around a woman who was no longer alive to shape it herself. That evening, as Grace unpacked her clothes into a closet that still smelled faintly of someone else's perfume, she heard the front door open and a voice she did not recognize call out through the hallway. "Ethan, are you home? I brought dinner." Grace stepped out of the bedroom just as a tall woman in an elegant coat walked into the living room, carrying 2 paper bags of food like she had done it 100 times before. The woman stopped the moment she saw Grace, and her expression shifted from warmth to something colder, more guarded. "Oh," the woman said, "you must be the new girlfriend." "Grace," Ethan said quickly, stepping between them. "This is my mother, Diane." Diane's eyes moved over Grace slowly, taking in every detail, as if measuring her against some invisible standard. "It's nice to meet you," she said, though her tone suggested the opposite. "I didn't realize Ethan had already moved someone into Claire's house." The words hit the room like a slap, and Grace felt her face grow warm with embarrassment and confusion. "Mom," Ethan said, a warning edge in his voice. "I'm only saying what everyone is thinking," Diane replied, setting the bags down on the kitchen counter with more force than necessary. "It hasn't even been that long." "It's been 6 years," Ethan said quietly. 6 years is nothing when you loved someone the way you loved Claire," Diane said, and then, almost as an afterthought, she glanced at Grace again. "No offense, dear." Grace stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether to defend herself or simply disappear into the next room. She looked at Ethan, waiting for him to say something, anything, to close the distance Diane had just opened between them. But Ethan only looked down at the floor, his jaw tight, saying nothing at all. That silence told Grace more than any words could have. Dinner that night was quiet and strained. Diane spoke mostly to Ethan, sharing stories about people Grace didn't know, referencing memories that clearly did not include her. Twice, Diane mentioned Claire by name, each time with a soft fondness that made it clear she was not simply remembering a woman who had died. She was mourning a daughter she had never gotten to have. When Diane finally left, Grace sat across from Ethan at the kitchen table, the leftover food growing cold between them. "Your mother doesn't like me," Grace said. "She just needs time," Ethan replied, though he wouldn't meet her eyes. "Time for what? To accept that you've moved on? Or time to accept that I exist at all?" Ethan didn't answer, and the silence stretched long enough that Grace understood she wasn't going to get a real response tonight. She stood, cleared the plates, and told herself that every new relationship faced obstacles. Every family took time to adjust. She told herself this was simply the beginning of something that would get easier with patience. She did not yet know that patience would be tested far beyond what she imagined. Later that night, unable to sleep, Grace wandered into the small study at the end of the hallway, a room Ethan had told her not to worry about. A room he said was full of old work files he hadn't gotten around to sorting. But when she pushed the door open and turned on the light, she found something else entirely. The walls were lined with photographs, Claire laughing on a hiking trail, Claire blowing out candles on a birthday cake, Claire wearing a white dress, standing beside Ethan at what looked like an engagement party. There were letters too, stacked neatly on a small desk, tied together with ribbon. A framed newspaper clipping sat near the window, and Grace's chest tightened as she read the headline. It was an obituary. This wasn't a room full of old work files. This was a memorial. A place where Ethan had quietly preserved every trace of the woman he had lost, untouched and unchanged for 6 long years. Grace heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his face pale. "You weren't supposed to see this," he said quietly. "Why not?" Grace asked, her voice trembling. "Ethan, this isn't healing. This is a shrine." "It's how I remember her," he said, his voice defensive now. "I'm allowed to remember her." "Of course you are," Grace said, stepping closer. "But you asked me to move in here, into her house, surrounded by her things, without telling me any of this. You let me believe we were building something new, when really, I'm living inside something that already happened, something that never really ended for you." Ethan's silence confirmed what Grace already feared. He had not asked her to move in to start something new. He had asked her to move in and fit herself quietly into a life that was still shaped entirely around someone else. "I love you," Ethan said finally. But even as he said it, his eyes drifted toward the photographs on the wall, and Grace felt something inside her crack. "I believe that you think you do," she whispered. "But I don't think you've left room for me to actually be loved. Not fully. Not the way I need." Ethan reached for her hand, but Grace stepped back, suddenly unsure of the home she had just moved into, unsure of the man she thought she knew, and terrified of the shadow that seemed to follow them into every room of this house. Outside, rain began to fall softly against the windows, and Grace stood in the doorway of a room built entirely for a woman who could no longer walk through it herself, wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life by falling in love with a man who had never truly said goodbye. Grace stood alone in the hallway for a long while after Ethan went to bed, listening to the quiet creak of the house settling around her. She thought about the months leading up to this day, how carefully she had allowed herself to fall for Ethan, how many small warning signs she had explained away because the good moments had always outweighed the strange ones. He had been attentive during their courtship, remembering the name of her childhood dog, showing up early to help her pack boxes from her old apartment, telling her more than once that she made him feel like himself again after a long, difficult stretch of years. She had believed him completely. She still wanted to believe him. Her own mother had warned her, gently, during a phone call weeks earlier. Moving in together so soon after meeting his family for the first time felt fast, her mother had said, though Grace had brushed the concern aside, certain that love this steady could not possibly be built on unstable ground. Standing now in a hallway lined with a dead woman's memory, she wondered if her mother had seen something she herself had been too eager to overlook. She walked slowly through the rest of the house that night, room by room, noticing details she had missed during her earlier hurried visits. A guest bedroom closet still held a woman's coat, tags removed but never worn. A kitchen drawer contained a stack of unopened greeting cards addressed to Claire, sent by relatives who apparently hadn't yet heard, or hadn't yet accepted, that she was gone. Grace closed each door gently as she found these things, unwilling to disturb them further that night, though the discoveries settled heavily inside her chest, one on top of another, until she felt she was carrying the weight of an entire life that had never fully ended. Grace did not leave that night. She told herself she owed Ethan a real conversation once the shock had settled, and she owed herself proof that this relationship could still become something honest. But the weeks that followed only widened the crack that had formed in the study, and no amount of patience seemed able to close it again. Every morning Grace passed the closed door of that room on her way to the kitchen, and every morning she felt the quiet pull of it, like a magnet hidden behind wood and paint. Ethan never mentioned it again, and he never suggested taking anything down. Instead, he simply began locking the door, as if hiding the room from Grace's eyes would somehow erase what she had already seen. "You don't have to hide it from me," Grace told him one morning, watching him twist the small key in the lock. "I already know it's there." "I'm not hiding anything," Ethan said, slipping the key into his pocket. "I just don't want it to be the first thing we see every day." Grace wanted to point out that a locked door was its own kind of confession, but she let the moment pass, choosing instead to focus on the parts of their life together that still felt good. There were mornings when Ethan made her coffee exactly the way she liked it, remembering details most people forgot. There were evenings when he listened to her talk about her work, asking real questions, laughing at her stories with a warmth that felt completely genuine. In those moments, Grace could almost forget about the locked door at the end of the hallway. Almost. At work, Grace found it harder than usual to concentrate. She managed a small team at a design firm downtown, a job she normally loved for the way it let her build something tangible out of scattered ideas. But that week her thoughts kept drifting back to the locked door at the end of the hallway. During a meeting about an upcoming client project, her manager had to repeat a question twice before Grace realized she had been asked something at all. "Everything okay?" her manager asked afterward, catching her in the hallway. "Just distracted," Grace said, forcing a smile. "Personal stuff. I'll be more focused tomorrow." She meant it when she said it, but the following days brought little improvement. She found herself replaying the contents of that room over and over, cataloging details she hadn't fully processed the first time. The dates on the letters, the careful way each photograph had been framed and hung, as though someone had once spent hours deciding exactly where each memory should live. It was not simply grief, Grace realized slowly. It was devotion, frozen in place, untouched by time, in a way that made her own presence in the house feel increasingly temporary, as though she were merely visiting a life that truly belonged to someone else. Diane visited often, always arriving unannounced, always finding some new reason to remind Grace that she did not quite belong. She would mention Claire's favorite meals while cooking dinner, request seating arrangements that Grace later learned mirrored old family gatherings, and speak about the wedding that never happened, as though it had simply been postponed rather than permanently lost. "Claire would have loved this season," Diane said one evening, arranging flowers in a vase that Grace recognized from the shrine room. "She always said autumn made her feel most alive." Grace said nothing, though the sentence sat heavy in her chest. She glanced at Ethan, hoping he might gently redirect his mother, but he only nodded along, lost in some memory Grace could not access no matter how hard she tried. Later that night, after Diane had gone home, Grace finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been building inside her for weeks. "Do you ever think about what it would take to actually let her go?" she asked, sitting beside Ethan on the couch, her voice gentle but firm. Ethan's body tensed immediately. "I have let her go," he said. "I'm here with you, aren't I?" "Physically, yes," Grace said. "But, Ethan, there's a locked room in this house that says otherwise. Your mother still sets an extra place in her heart for a woman who died 6 years ago, and you let her do it without ever correcting her." "She's still grieving," Ethan said. "So are you," Grace replied softly. "And I understand grief. I do. But grief that never moves, that stays frozen exactly where it started, isn't healing anymore. It's a way of staying loyal to the past instead of building something with the person right in front of you." Ethan stood up abruptly, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand what it was like," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Claire and I were supposed to get married in 3 months. She died in an accident 2 weeks before the wedding. Do you have any idea what that does to a person?" Grace's heart broke a little at the pain in his voice, and she reached for his hand, pulling him gently back down beside her. "I can't imagine it," she admitted, "and I'm not asking you to forget her, or to pretend she never existed. I'm asking you to make room for me too. Right now, it feels like I'm living in the space between what you had and what you lost, and there's nothing left over for what we could actually have." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing, staring at the floor as though the answer might be written there. Then, quietly, he said, "I don't know how to do that." It was the most honest thing he had said to her in weeks, and Grace held on to it like a small light in a dark room. Maybe honesty was the first step. Maybe if he could admit how lost he still felt, they could find a way forward together. But the following weekend, everything shifted again. Ethan's younger sister, Lily Cole, came to visit, and Grace found in her an unexpected ally. Lily was warm and direct, with none of Diane's cold formality, and she pulled Grace aside in the kitchen while Ethan was outside taking a phone call. "I need to tell you something," Lily said, glancing toward the door to make sure Ethan wasn't nearby. "You deserve to know what you're dealing with." Grace's stomach tightened. "Okay." "Claire wasn't perfect," Lily said quietly. "None of us wanted to say it after she died, because it felt cruel to speak badly of someone who was gone. But their relationship wasn't as flawless as my mother makes it sound. They fought constantly before the accident. Claire had actually asked for space, just weeks before the wedding. Ethan never told anyone that part, because it was easier to grieve a perfect love than admit the truth." Grace stared at Lily, stunned. "Why didn't he tell me any of this?" "Because admitting the truth means admitting that maybe things weren't meant to be, and grief is easier when you build the person up into something they never fully were," Lily said. "My mother does the same thing. It's easier to worship a memory than face how complicated real love actually was." "Does your mother know you told me this?" Grace asked quietly. "No," Lily said, shaking her head firmly. "And please, don't mention it to her, or to Ethan either, not directly. It would only cause more damage right now. I'm telling you because I think you deserve context, not because I want to start a war in this family. We've had enough of those already," quietly, underneath the surface, for years. Grace nodded, appreciating the honesty even as it complicated everything further. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she said. "I like you, Grace," Lily said, offering a small, tired smile. "You're the first person Ethan has brought around in years who actually challenges him, instead of just going along with whatever keeps the peace. That matters more than you probably realize." The information sat heavy in Grace's chest for the rest of the evening. She watched Ethan differently now, wondering how much of his devotion to Claire's memory was genuine love, and how much was guilt over a relationship that had been unraveling before it ever had the chance to fully break. That night, after Lily had gone home and the house had settled into silence, Grace found herself standing outside the locked study door again, her fingers resting lightly against the wood. She thought about knocking, about waking Ethan and demanding the whole truth. But something stopped her. Not fear, exactly, but a quiet understanding that some truths had to be discovered in their own time, and pushing too hard, too fast, might only make Ethan retreat further into the past, instead of stepping toward her. She turned away from the door and walked back to their bedroom, where Ethan lay sleeping peacefully, unaware of the conversation that had just reshaped everything Grace thought she understood about his grief. In the morning, she decided not to mention what Lily had told her. Instead, she resolved to watch more closely, to pay attention to the small cracks in Ethan's careful narrative, and to wait for the moment when the truth would surface on its own. She did not yet know how soon that moment would come, or how painful it would be when it finally arrived. For now, she simply made breakfast, poured 2 cups of coffee, and sat across from the man she loved, wondering how many more locked doors stood between them, and whether love alone would ever be enough to open them. The invitation arrived on a Thursday, tucked into the mailbox between bills and advertisements, and the moment Grace saw the elegant handwriting on the envelope, she knew exactly who had sent it. "Your mother wants us at a family dinner," Grace said, holding up the card as Ethan walked through the door after work. "This Saturday. It says it's a celebration." Ethan took the card, and his expression shifted the moment he read the details. "It's the anniversary of my father's retirement," he said. "The whole family gets together every year." "Should I be worried?" Grace asked, only half joking. "You'll be fine," Ethan said, though he didn't quite meet her eyes when he said it. Grace spent the next 2 days trying to convince herself that this dinner would be different, that perhaps enough time had passed for Diane to soften, even slightly, toward the idea of Ethan building a life with someone new. She chose her outfit carefully, practiced polite conversation topics in her head, and told herself that showing genuine warmth might finally break through Diane's resistance. She was wrong. Grace called her closest friend, Olivia, her old college roommate turned confidant, the night before the dinner, needing someone outside the situation to help steady her nerves. "You don't have to go, you know," her friend said over the phone. "You could tell him you're not feeling well." "I want to go," Grace said, though her voice wavered slightly. I want to prove to myself, and maybe to Diane, that I'm not going anywhere. If I keep avoiding these moments, I'll never know whether this family could actually make room for me. Just promise me you won't let her get under your skin, her friend said. You're allowed to leave a room, Grace. You're allowed to protect your own peace. Grace promised, though she wasn't entirely sure, hanging up the phone, that she would be able to keep that promise once she was actually standing inside the Cole family home again. The Cole family home was large and elegant, filled with the kind of quiet luxury that made Grace feel slightly out of place the moment she stepped through the door. Relatives she had never met greeted Ethan warmly, hugging him, laughing with him, clearly comfortable in the world he had grown up in. Grace stood slightly behind him, smiling politely, introducing herself again and again to people who seemed to forget her name almost as quickly as she said it. Dinner began pleasantly enough. Diane sat at the head of the table, directing the conversation with practiced ease, asking about careers and travel plans and family updates. Grace answered questions when asked, careful to seem engaged without overstepping, still hoping the evening might pass without incident. Then Diane raised her glass for a toast. 6 years ago, Diane began, her voice carrying easily across the table. We lost someone very dear to this family. Claire would have been sitting at this table tonight, celebrating with all of us, if things had gone differently. The table fell quiet. Grace felt every eye shift briefly toward her, then away, as if everyone understood the discomfort of the moment except the one person causing it. She would have made such a beautiful bride, Diane continued, her eyes glistening. I still remember helping her choose her dress. I still have it, hanging in the guest closet. I could never bring myself to give it away. Grace glanced at Ethan, waiting for him to gently redirect the conversation, to acknowledge the awkwardness of celebrating a woman who was not present while his current partner sat quietly beside him. But Ethan only stared down at his plate, his jaw tight, saying nothing at all. To Claire, Diane said, raising her glass higher. Forever a part of this family. Around the table, relatives raised their glasses in response, murmuring Claire's name with quiet reverence. Grace sat frozen, her own glass untouched, unsure whether joining the toast would feel like betrayal to herself or refusing would feel like disrespect to everyone else. In the end, she lifted her glass slightly, just enough to seem polite, while her chest burned with humiliation. An older relative Grace hadn't been introduced to, an aunt with silver hair and a kind but curious face, leaned toward her during the awkward pause that followed the toast. You must be Ethan's new girlfriend, the woman said, not unkindly. It's brave of you, coming to one of these dinners. This family holds on to its memories rather tightly. So I've noticed, Grace said, managing a small, polite smile. For what it's worth, the aunt continued quietly, glancing toward Diane across the room. I always thought it was unhealthy, the way we all kept Claire so present at every gathering. Grief needs room to breathe eventually. I hope you don't let it push you away. The comment stayed with Grace for the rest of the evening, a small, unexpected kindness in a room that otherwise seemed determined to remind her exactly how little she belonged. After dinner, as the family gathered in the living room for coffee, Diane approached Grace directly for the first time all evening. I hope tonight wasn't too uncomfortable for you, Diane said, her tone sweet but her words sharp underneath. We simply believe in honoring the people we've loved even after they're gone. Claire will always have a place in this family, whether Ethan moves on or not. I understand honoring someone's memory, Grace said carefully, choosing her words with care. But I think there's a difference between honoring the past and refusing to make room for the present. Diane's smile tightened. Ethan chose to bring you into this family, dear. That doesn't mean the rest of us have to erase everything that came before you. I'm not asking anyone to erase anything, Grace said, her voice steady despite the tremor building in her chest. I'm asking to be seen as more than a placeholder. Diane's eyes flashed with something sharp and cold. Perhaps you should ask yourself why Ethan still hasn't proposed after all this time, she said quietly, before turning and walking away, leaving Grace standing alone in the middle of a room full of strangers who all seemed to know something she didn't. The drive home was silent. Grace stared out the window, replaying the entire evening in her mind, feeling smaller with every mile that passed. When they finally reached the house, she turned to Ethan the moment he closed the front door behind them. You said nothing, she said. The whole night, you said nothing. What did you want me to say? Ethan asked, his voice tired. I wanted you to stand up for me, Grace said, her voice breaking slightly. I wanted you to tell your mother that I matter, that this relationship matters, that Claire's memory doesn't get to overshadow everything we're trying to build. Instead, you sat there and let her toast to a woman who died 6 years ago, while I sat right beside you, invisible. My mother lost someone too, Ethan said. She's allowed to grieve however she needs to. I'm not denying her grief, Grace said. I'm asking why my feelings never seem to matter as much as everyone else's grief in this family. Why is it always my job to be understanding, patient, forgiving, while nobody ever has to make room for me? Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration written across his face. It's complicated, Grace. You don't understand what it was like, losing her the way I did, right before the wedding. Everyone in my family was devastated. It changed all of us. I do understand loss, Grace said. But Ethan, it has been 6 years. At some point, holding on to grief this tightly stops being about honoring Claire and starts being about avoiding the harder work of actually moving forward. With me, with anyone. Grace sat down slowly on the couch, exhaustion settling into her bones. Do you know what your mother said to me tonight, right before we left? She asked why you still haven't proposed after all this time, as if the answer were obvious, as if everyone in that room already understood something I've been too hopeful to admit to myself. Ethan's expression flickered with something like guilt. That's not fair of her to say. Maybe not, Grace said. But is it true? Is that why you haven't asked me? Because some part of you is still waiting for permission from a woman who's been gone for 6 years? Ethan didn't answer immediately, and the silence itself felt like confirmation. Grace closed her eyes briefly, steadying her breath before continuing. I'm not asking for a proposal tonight, she said quietly. I'm asking for honesty. I need to know if you actually see a future with me, or if I'm simply someone who's been patient enough to stay while you figure out how to feel whole again. Silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Ethan looked away first, staring toward the hallway that led to the locked study, as though the room itself might offer some kind of answer. I don't know how to let go completely, he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Every time I try, I feel like I'm betraying her memory, like I'm saying her death didn't matter enough to change me forever. Grace stepped closer, softening despite her hurt. Loving someone new doesn't erase the love you had before, she said gently. But refusing to fully love someone new, because you're afraid of betraying a memory, isn't loyalty either. It's just another way of staying stuck. Ethan didn't respond, and Grace realized, with a growing ache in her chest, that she had said everything she could possibly say. The rest was up to him. That night, Grace lay awake long after Ethan had fallen asleep beside her, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Diane's parting words. Why hasn't he proposed after all this time? The question circled endlessly in her mind, refusing to let her rest. The next morning, while Ethan was at work, Grace found herself standing outside the locked study door once more. This time, her hand did not hesitate. She remembered seeing Ethan slip the small key into the drawer of the hallway table weeks ago, and before she could talk herself out of it, she retrieved it, turned it in the lock, and stepped inside. The room looked exactly as she remembered it, photographs lining every wall, letters stacked neatly on the desk. But this time, Grace noticed something she had missed before. Tucked into the corner of the desk was a small velvet box. Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a delicate engagement ring, clearly meant for someone else, clearly meant for a wedding that had never happened. Beside the box sat a folded letter, the paper yellowed slightly with age. Grace knew she shouldn't read it, knew this was crossing a line she couldn't uncross, but her curiosity, sharpened by months of confusion and quiet humiliation, pushed her forward anyway. The letter was written in Ethan's handwriting, dated just days before Claire's accident. Grace's eyes moved quickly across the words, and what she read stole the breath from her lungs entirely. The letter was not a love letter. It was a letter of doubt. Ethan had written about feeling trapped, about wondering whether marrying Claire was truly what he wanted, about a growing distance between them that neither of them seemed able to fix. He had never sent it. He had never told anyone. And then, 2 weeks later, Claire was gone, and whatever doubts he carried became frozen forever inside a tragedy too painful to examine honestly. Grace sat on the edge of the desk, the letter trembling in her hands, finally understanding the truth Lily had hinted at weeks earlier. Ethan wasn't mourning a perfect love cut tragically short. He was mourning a relationship that had been quietly falling apart, and using grief as a way to avoid ever facing that painful, complicated truth. She heard the front door open downstairs, followed by Ethan's footsteps moving through the house, calling her name. Grace quickly folded the letter, placed it back exactly where she had found it, and stepped out of the study just as Ethan appeared at the end of the hallway, his expression shifting instantly to alarm when he saw where she was standing. "You went in there," he said quietly, his voice tight. "Yes," Grace said, holding his gaze steadily despite the storm building inside her. "And I think it's time we talked about what really happened between you and Claire." before you decide whether you're capable of truly moving forward with me." Ethan's face went pale, and for the first time since Grace had met him, he looked completely unable to hide behind the careful, practiced calm he always wore. The truth, buried for 6 years, had finally found its way into the light, and there was no locked door left strong enough to keep it hidden any longer. Ethan didn't deny the letter. He simply sat down at the kitchen table, his shoulders sinking under the weight of 6 years of silence, and told Grace everything. He explained how he and Claire had been drifting apart in the months before the wedding, how neither of them had known how to say it out loud, how the accident had happened before either of them could face the truth honestly. He told her how easy it had been, after her death, to let grief rewrite the story into something simpler, something where Claire remained perfect and their love remained flawless, because the alternative felt unbearable. "I turned her into someone she wasn't," Ethan admitted quietly, staring at his hands. "Not because I was lying exactly, but because it hurt less to remember her that way." Grace listened without interrupting, feeling something shift inside her chest, a mixture of sympathy and exhaustion. She understood grief now in a way she hadn't before, but understanding it didn't erase the damage it had caused. It didn't erase the locked door, the humiliating toast, the months of feeling like a stranger in her own home. "I need you to actually let her go," Grace said finally. "Not forget her, not pretend she didn't matter, but let go of the version of her you built to protect yourself from the truth." Ethan nodded slowly, and for a moment, Grace believed something had genuinely shifted between them. But belief, she would soon learn, was not the same as change. In the weeks that followed, small things improved. Ethan finally cleared out most of the study, boxing up photographs and letters, though he could not yet bring himself to remove everything completely. He asked his mother to stop mentioning Claire during family dinners, a request Diane accepted with visible reluctance rather than genuine understanding. The house began to feel, for the first time, like it might actually belong to both of them. Still, something in Ethan remained distant. He was present physically, attentive in small ways, but emotionally he seemed to hold himself back, as though fully committing to Grace meant risking another loss he wasn't sure he could survive. Grace noticed the way he flinched slightly whenever she made long-term plans out loud, the way he changed the subject whenever marriage came up between friends, the way he seemed to love her carefully, cautiously, like something breakable. It was during this uncertain, fragile time that Noah Hale entered Grace's life. Noah worked at the marketing firm down the hall from Grace's office, and their paths crossed first over a shared elevator ride, then over coffee in the building's small cafe, then over increasingly regular lunch breaks that Grace found herself looking forward to more than she wanted to admit. Noah was easy to talk to in a way that felt refreshing, after months of careful, guarded conversations with Ethan. He laughed easily, listened attentively, and never once made Grace feel like she was competing with someone else's memory. "You seem distracted today," Noah said one afternoon as they sat across from each other at their usual table, sunlight streaming through the cafe windows. "Just tired," Grace said, stirring her coffee absently. "Things have been complicated at home." "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," Noah said gently. "But I'm a decent listener, if you ever need one." Grace hesitated, then found herself telling him more than she intended. Not everything. Not the locked room or the letter she had found, but enough. Enough about feeling invisible, about competing with a memory she could never outshine, about loving someone who seemed permanently unable to fully choose her. Noah listened without judgment, his expression thoughtful and kind. "It sounds exhausting," he said finally, "fighting for someone who won't fully fight for you back." The words settled uncomfortably close to the truth, and Grace found herself nodding before she could stop herself. Noah had recently moved to the city from a smaller town 2 hours north, and he often joked that he was still learning how to navigate a life where he didn't know everyone at the local coffee shop by name. His openness about starting over, about rebuilding a social life from nothing, made him easy to talk to in a way that felt refreshingly uncomplicated. He asked Grace questions about her work with genuine curiosity, remembered small details from earlier conversations, and never once made her feel like she was competing with anything or anyone. "You're good at this," Grace told him one afternoon, watching him sketch out a rough concept for a client presentation on a napkin, his pen moving quickly and confidently. "Good at napkins?" Noah asked, grinning. "Good at making things feel simple," Grace said. "Everything with you just feels straightforward." "It's nice." Noah's expression softened slightly at the comment, though he said nothing more about it, and Grace didn't examine too closely why the observation had slipped out so easily, or why it had felt so good to say out loud. Over the following weeks, her friendship with Noah deepened in small, quiet ways. He remembered details from their conversations, checked in on hard days, celebrated her small wins at work with genuine enthusiasm. There was nothing dramatic about it, nothing that felt like betrayal in the moment, just the steady comfort of being fully seen by someone who wasn't distracted by ghosts. Grace told herself it was simply friendship, and for a long time, she believed that completely. But friendship rarely stayed still for long, especially not when it filled a space that should have been occupied by someone else. At his own office, Ethan found himself unable to focus during a routine budget meeting, his mind drifting back to the sound of Grace's laughter drifting from the kitchen the night before, a laughter he hadn't fully earned in months. A colleague nudged him twice before he realized he had been asked to weigh in on a proposal. "You've been somewhere else all week," his colleague said afterward, only half joking. "Just a lot going on at home," Ethan admitted, rubbing his eyes. He didn't explain further, mostly because he wasn't entirely sure how to put words to the discomfort building steadily inside him. It wasn't quite anger, and it wasn't quite fear, though it carried elements of both. It felt, if he was honest with himself, like watching something valuable slip slowly through his fingers, one small moment at a time, while he stood frozen, unsure how to close his hand around it before it disappeared completely. Ethan noticed the change before Grace fully admitted it to herself. She smiled more at her phone during quiet evenings at home. She mentioned Noah's name more often than she probably realized, weaving him casually into stories about her day. She seemed lighter around this new friend, in a way Ethan hadn't seen in months, and the observation planted something uncomfortable and unfamiliar in his chest. "Who's Noah?" Ethan asked one evening, trying to keep his voice casual as Grace typed a quick reply to a message. "Just a friend from work," Grace said, setting her phone down. "We've been getting lunch sometimes." "Sometimes, or often?" Ethan asked. Grace looked up, surprised by the edge in his voice. "Why does it matter?" "It doesn't," Ethan said quickly, though his tone suggested otherwise. "I'm just asking." Grace studied him for a moment, noticing something new in his expression, something she hadn't seen before in all their months together. It wasn't quite suspicion, and it wasn't quite anger. It looked almost like fear. She let the conversation drop, unwilling to examine too closely what it might mean that Ethan, who had spent 6 years unable to fully release his grip on a woman who was no longer alive, suddenly seemed threatened by the presence of a man who was simply her friend. Over dinner one evening, Lily visited again, and this time it was Grace who pulled her aside, needing someone to talk to who understood the family's complicated history. "I think Ethan is jealous," Grace admitted quietly, scraping toward the living room where Ethan sat scrolling through his phone, unusually quiet since their conversation earlier that day. "Of what?" Lily asked. "A friend from work," Grace said. "Nothing has happened. Nothing would happen, but he's been different since I mentioned him." Lily studied her brother thoughtfully through the doorway. "That's interesting," she said slowly. "Ethan has never been the jealous type, not even with Claire, from what I remember. He was always fairly relaxed about things like that." "So why now?" Grace asked. Lily considered the question carefully before answering. "Maybe because deep down he knows exactly how easy it would be to lose you, the way he's been treating this relationship," she said. "Grief made him careless with what was right in front of him. Maybe some part of him is finally waking up to that, and it's terrifying him." Grace turned the words over in her mind long after Lily had gone home. She wanted to believe that Ethan's jealousy meant he was finally realizing what he had been risking, finally understanding how close he had come to losing something valuable through sheer neglect. But she also wondered whether jealousy without real change was simply another way of avoiding the harder, more vulnerable work of actually choosing someone completely. That night, as she lay in bed beside him, Ethan finally broke the silence that had settled between them since dinner. "I don't like the way you talk about him," Ethan admitted quietly into the darkness. "Noah." "Why not?" Grace asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because you sound happy when you talk about him," Ethan said. "Happier than you've sounded talking about me in a long time." Grace didn't respond right away, letting the honesty of his words settle in the space between them. It was the most vulnerable thing Ethan had said to her in months, and part of her wanted to reach for him, to reassure him that nothing was happening, that her heart still belonged fully to him. But another part of her, the part that remembered the locked door, the humiliating toast, the months of feeling invisible, wondered if perhaps Ethan needed to feel exactly this uncertain, exactly this afraid of losing her, before he would finally be willing to fight for what they had, instead of quietly assuming she would always be there, waiting patiently in the shadow of a memory he refused to fully release. "Maybe you should ask yourself why that is," Grace said softly, turning away from him in the darkness, leaving the question hanging heavily in the silence of their bedroom, unanswered and unresolved, as the first quiet seeds of real jealousy began taking root in Ethan's chest. The seed grew faster than either of them expected. Ethan found himself checking Grace's phone screen when messages lit up during dinner, not out of any real intention to snoop, but out of an anxious curiosity he couldn't fully control. He noticed the small ways she had changed, the extra care she took getting ready for work, the lightness in her voice when she mentioned lunch plans, and every small observation tightened the knot forming steadily in his chest. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself Grace loved him, that nothing improper was happening, that his own insecurity was simply catching up with months of neglecting the relationship in favor of a grief he had never properly processed. But knowing the source of a feeling rarely made the feeling itself any easier to bear. One evening, arriving home earlier than expected, Ethan found Grace laughing at something on her phone, her expression open and easy in a way that struck him harder than he anticipated. "Good day?" he asked, setting his keys down carefully, watching her face shift slightly at the sound of his voice. "Noah sent me something funny from a meeting," Grace said, still smiling as she set the phone face down on the counter. "Nothing important." Ethan nodded, forcing his expression into something neutral, though inside, something sharp and unfamiliar twisted tightly in his stomach. He had spent 6 years locked inside grief so consuming that jealousy had never found room to grow. Now, faced with the very real possibility of losing Grace, that same capacity for deep, overwhelming feeling turned suddenly toward fear instead of sorrow. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said, his voice careful. "Of course," Grace replied. "Do you have feelings for him?" The question hung in the air between them, and Grace considered it honestly before answering, refusing to dismiss it too quickly or too defensively. "I care about him as a friend," she said finally. "He's been kind to me during a time when I felt mostly invisible in my own relationship. But I haven't crossed any lines, Ethan, and I'm not planning to." "That's not exactly an answer," Ethan said quietly. "It's the truth," Grace replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "What you're really asking is whether I still love you, and whether that's enough to keep me here, waiting for you to finally choose this relationship completely. That's a fair question. But it's one only you can help answer, by showing me who you're actually choosing, day after day." Ethan had no response to that, and the silence between them stretched long into the evening, heavy with everything neither of them was quite ready to say out loud. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He drove to the small cemetery on the edge of town, parking near the old oak tree that shaded Claire's resting place, and sat there for nearly an hour in silence, gathering thoughts he had never allowed himself to fully form. "I think I finally understand what I did to both of us," he said quietly, the words feeling strange and necessary all at once. "I turned you into something you weren't, because it was easier than admitting we were struggling before the accident. I'm sorry for that. You deserve to be remembered honestly, not turned into a reason to avoid loving anyone else." He sat there a while longer, the wind moving gently through the branches above him, and when he finally stood to leave, something in his chest felt lighter than it had in years, as though a weight he had carried without realizing its full size had finally begun to loosen its grip. 2 days later, Diane called Ethan directly, her voice sharp with concern. "I heard Grace has been spending a great deal of time with some man from her office," Diane said, without any preamble. "How did you hear that?" Ethan asked, startled. "It doesn't matter how," Diane replied. "What matters is that you need to pay attention, Ethan. You cannot keep drifting through this relationship the way you have been, half here and half somewhere else, and expect her to stay patient forever. Even I can see that." The comment stung more than Ethan expected, mostly because he knew his mother was right, and knowing it did nothing to make it easier to hear. "I thought you didn't even like Grace," Ethan said. "I never said I disliked her," Diane replied, her voice softening slightly. "I said I missed Claire. Those are two very different things, and perhaps it's time I remembered that more clearly myself. But Ethan, listen to me carefully. If you lose this woman because you were too afraid to fully let go of the past, you will spend the rest of your life regretting it far more than you have ever regretted anything about Claire." Ethan sat with his mother's words long after the call ended, feeling something shift uncomfortably inside him, an awareness he had been avoiding for months finally forcing its way to the surface. That weekend, Grace mentioned an office event, a casual gathering after work to celebrate a successful project launch. She invited Ethan to join, mentioning almost casually that Noah would likely be there too. He sat in his car in the parking garage for several minutes before going in, gathering himself, telling himself firmly that there was nothing to worry about, that Grace loved him, that a work friendship meant exactly what it claimed to mean and nothing more. But the closer he got to the entrance, the harder it became to quiet the uneasy voice in the back of his mind, the one that kept reminding him how distant he had been, how many chances he had already let slip past without reaching for them. Ethan arrived late, delayed by a work call he couldn't avoid, and the moment he stepped into the crowded venue, his eyes searched immediately for Grace. He found her near the back of the room, laughing at something, standing close to a tall, confident man Ethan recognized instantly, without needing an introduction, as Noah Hale. Something hot and unfamiliar surged through Ethan's chest as he watched them together. Noah said something that made Grace laugh again, resting a hand briefly on her shoulder in a gesture that was casual, friendly, completely appropriate, and yet it landed on Ethan like a physical blow. He crossed the room quickly, arriving beside Grace with a tightness in his jaw he couldn't quite hide. "Ethan," Grace said, surprised. "You made it." "Wouldn't miss it," Ethan said, his voice carrying an edge that surprised even himself. Noah extended a hand warmly. "You must be Ethan. Grace has mentioned you." Ethan shook his hand briefly, forcing a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Has she?" he said, more statement than question. An awkward silence settled over the small group, and Grace glanced between the two men, sensing the tension building beneath the surface of the polite exchange. "I'm going to grab another drink," Noah said diplomatically, excusing himself with practiced ease. The moment he stepped away, Grace turned to Ethan, her expression sharp with frustration. "What was that?" "What was what?" Ethan asked, though he already knew exactly what she meant. "You were rude to him," Grace said. "For no reason." "For no reason," Ethan repeated, his voice rising slightly, months of buried tension finally cracking open. "Grace," he had his hand on your shoulder. "He looks at you like..." "Like what?" Grace interrupted, crossing her arms. "Like he's waiting for his chance," Ethan said, the words spilling out before he could stop them, raw and unguarded in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. Grace stared at him, stunned by the sudden intensity in his voice. "And if he is," she said slowly, "whose fault would that actually be?" "I didn't go looking for someone else's attention, Ethan. I was starving for basic acknowledgement in my own relationship, and Noah simply happened to notice me when you were too busy mourning a woman who died 6 years ago to notice I was slowly disappearing right in front of you." The words landed with brutal honesty, and Ethan flinched as though struck. Around them, the party continued, oblivious to the quiet devastation unfolding in the corner of the room. "I know I haven't been fair to you," Ethan said, his voice suddenly quieter, stripped of its earlier defensiveness. "I know I've kept you at a distance, even while asking you to build a life with me. But Grace, seeing him with you tonight, I felt something I haven't let myself feel in years. I was terrified, genuinely terrified of losing you." Grace's expression softened slightly, though her guard remained firmly in place. "Being scared of losing someone isn't the same as actually choosing them," she said. "Ethan, I need you to understand that. Jealousy proves you still care. It doesn't prove you're ready to fully commit." "Then tell me what would prove it," Ethan said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Tell me what I need to do, and I'll do it." Grace studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the same familiar hesitation she had grown used to seeing, the careful distance he always kept even in his most vulnerable moments. But something had genuinely shifted tonight. The fear in his eyes was real, immediate, unguarded, in a way she had never witnessed before. "You need to go home," Grace said finally, "and finish what you started weeks ago. Every photograph, every letter, that ring you never gave her, sitting in that drawer like some unfinished promise. All of it needs to be gone. Completely. Not because Claire didn't matter, but because I deserve a life that isn't constantly competing with a memory." "And if I do that?" Ethan asked. "What happens then?" "Then we'll see," Grace said honestly. "I can't promise you everything will simply go back to normal. Too much has happened for that. But it would be a real start, Ethan, a start built on truth instead of avoidance." Ethan nodded slowly, something resolute settling over his features for the first time in months. He glanced across the room, finding Noah in easy conversation with a group of colleagues, completely unaware of the quiet turning point his simple presence had triggered. "I owe you 6 years of choices I never fully made," Ethan said quietly. "I'm done avoiding that." Grace watched him carefully, wanting desperately to believe him, yet cautious enough to withhold full hope until his words became action. Jealousy had cracked something open inside Ethan tonight, forcing him to finally confront the depth of what he stood to lose. But cracks alone did not rebuild a foundation. Only what he chose to do next would determine whether this moment became the beginning of real change, or simply another empty promise destined to fade quietly back into old, familiar patterns. As the party continued around them, Ethan reached for Grace's hand, holding it firmly, deliberately, in a way he hadn't allowed himself in months. For the first time since she had moved into his house, Grace felt something that resembled real hope, fragile, but present, flickering quietly beneath the uncertainty that still surrounded them both. Ethan did not wait until morning. They left the party together, and instead of driving home in comfortable silence, Ethan pulled into the driveway with a determination Grace had never seen in him before. He walked straight to the hallway table, retrieved the small key from the drawer, and unlocked the study door without hesitation, flipping on the light and standing in the doorway as though seeing the room clearly for the first time in years. "Ethan," Grace said softly, standing behind him, "you don't have to do this tonight." "Yes," he said, turning to look at her, his eyes steady despite the emotion behind them. "I do. I've waited 6 years to do this, and I'm not waiting another single night." He began with the photographs, taking each one down carefully, not with anger or resentment, but with a quiet, respectful tenderness that told Grace he wasn't erasing Claire out of spite. He was simply, finally, allowing himself to place her memory somewhere appropriate, rather than somewhere that had slowly become a prison for them both. "I loved her," Ethan said, placing a photograph gently into a box. "That love was real, even if it wasn't as perfect as I let myself believe after she died. She deserved better than to become a shrine instead of a memory." Grace helped him quietly, boxing letters, wrapping the framed obituary in soft cloth, working alongside him without judgment or impatience. This wasn't about erasing 6 years of his life. It was about finally allowing that chapter to close properly, so a new one could genuinely begin. When they reached the small velvet box containing the engagement ring meant for Claire, Ethan held it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I never gave this to her," he said quietly. "I kept telling myself I would, once we worked through whatever was happening between us. Then there was no more time left to give it." "What will you do with it?" Grace asked gently. "I think it belongs with her family," Ethan said after a moment's thought. "Not hidden away in a drawer where it doesn't mean anything anymore. Somewhere it can actually be honored." Grace nodded, understanding the significance of the decision. This wasn't a man discarding his past carelessly. This was a man finally learning how to honor it appropriately, instead of letting it quietly consume everything meant to come after. By the time they finished, the study stood nearly empty, stripped of 6 years of careful preservation, ready to become something new entirely. Ethan stood in the center of the room, looking around at the bare walls, and for the first time, Grace saw something shift completely in his expression. Relief, mixed with grief, mixed with something that looked remarkably like freedom. "I think this could be a good office space," Ethan said quietly. "Or maybe something else entirely, something that belongs to us, instead of something inherited from before." "I'd like that," Grace said softly, reaching for his hand. The following weeks brought real, tangible change, the kind Grace had almost stopped believing was possible. Ethan called his mother directly, calmly but firmly, explaining that family gatherings could no longer center around Claire's memory in ways that disregarded Grace's feelings. Diane resisted at first, her voice sharp with old habits, but Ethan held his ground with a steadiness that surprised them both. "I loved Claire," Ethan told his mother during that difficult phone call, Grace sitting quietly beside him for support. "But she's gone, Mom, and I can't keep living in a version of the past that isn't fair to Grace, or honestly, isn't even fair to me anymore. I need you to respect that, if you want to remain close to both of us." Diane was quiet for a long moment before finally responding, her voice softer than Grace had ever heard it. "I suppose I've been holding on to her for both of us," she admitted. It felt like letting go meant losing her completely, all over again. "You don't have to erase her," Ethan said gently. "None of us do. But there's a difference between remembering someone with love and refusing to let anyone else fully exist beside that memory." A week after that difficult phone call, Diane arrived at the house again, though this time she called ahead, and this time she carried no stories rehearsed for comparison. She stood a little awkwardly on the front porch, holding a small potted plant instead of her usual elaborate dishes. "I thought this might look nice in the new reading room," Diane said, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Lily mentioned you'd cleared out the study." "Would you like to see it?" Grace asked, surprising herself with the warmth in her own voice. Diane nodded, and Grace led her down the hallway, watching the older woman's face carefully as she stepped into the transformed space. For a long moment, Diane said nothing, taking in the bright curtains, the empty shelves waiting to be filled, the complete absence of anything that once belonged to Claire. "It's peaceful in here," Diane said finally, her eyes glistening slightly. "I suppose I forgot what peace was supposed to feel like. After losing her, I only knew how to hold on." "You're allowed to grieve however you need to," Grace said gently. "I just needed some room to exist too." Diane turned to look at her directly, something softening completely in her expression for the first time since they had met. "I think I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "A real one, not the kind I've been offering these past months." "I'd like that," Grace said honestly. "I'm sorry," Diane said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it, "for making you feel like a placeholder in this family, when you've clearly been exactly what my son needed all along, even if it took him far too long to see it." The conversation marked a genuine turning point, not just between Ethan and Grace, but within the entire family. Diane's visits became less frequent, but noticeably warmer, her comments about Claire eventually fading into occasional, gentle mentions rather than constant, painful comparisons. It would take time, Grace understood, for old patterns to fully unwind, but the direction had clearly changed. Meanwhile, Grace's friendship with Noah settled naturally into its proper place. She continued having lunch with him occasionally, grateful for his kindness during a difficult chapter of her life, but the emotional intensity that had briefly threatened to grow between them faded as Ethan finally began showing up fully in the relationship that mattered most. Noah, perceptive as ever, seemed to sense the shift without needing an explanation. "You look happier," Noah told her one afternoon, weeks after the office party. "Whatever changed at home, it's working." "It is," Grace admitted, smiling genuinely for the first time in months. "Thank you, Noah, for everything, for seeing me when I needed to be seen." "That's what friends are for," Noah said simply, and Grace understood with quiet relief that this was exactly what he had always intended to be, a friend, present at exactly the right moment, without ever asking for anything more. One evening, several weeks after the transformation of the study, Ethan asked Grace to join him for a walk through the small park near their house, the same park where they had first met over a year earlier. The evening air was cool and clear, the kind of quiet, ordinary beauty that made significant moments feel even more meaningful. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened this year," Ethan said as they walked slowly along the familiar path, "about how close I came to losing you, simply because I was too afraid to properly close one chapter before starting another." "We both learned a lot," Grace said softly. "I did," Ethan agreed. "I learned that grief left unchecked doesn't protect the people we lost. It just quietly punishes the people still standing in front of us, waiting to be loved fully." He stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "I don't want to waste another day being careful with you, Grace. I don't want to hold anything back anymore." He reached into his coat pocket, and Grace's breath caught as he knelt down before her, holding a small box she recognized instantly as new, nothing at all like the one that had sat locked away in that study for 6 long years. "I know I made you wait far longer than you should have had to," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I know I let jealousy, rather than genuine choice, be the thing that finally woke me up. But Grace, I am choosing you now, completely, with nothing held back and nothing hidden. Will you marry me?" Grace felt tears rise in her eyes, not from the fairy tale surprise of the moment, but from the deep, earned relief of finally being chosen fully, after months of feeling like an afterthought in her own relationship. "Yes," she said softly, pulling him up into her arms the moment he slid the ring onto her finger. "Yes, Ethan, I choose you too." They stood together in the quiet park, the last light of evening settling gently around them, two people who had nearly lost each other to the weight of an unresolved past, finally standing fully present in a future they had chosen deliberately, together, with open eyes and open hearts. The road that led them there had not been easy. It had been marked by locked doors, painful toasts, uncomfortable truths, and the sharp, unexpected sting of jealousy finally forcing a reluctant heart to wake up. But standing there, wrapped in each other's arms beneath the darkening sky, both of them understood that some of the strongest relationships are not the ones that never face difficulty, but the ones brave enough to walk through it honestly, and come out the other side finally, completely, whole. Spring arrived quietly, the way it often does, without announcement, simply softening the edges of winter until warmth became undeniable again. Grace stood in the doorway of what had once been a locked study, now transformed into a bright reading room, with soft yellow curtains and shelves filled with books she and Ethan had collected together over the past several months. Sunlight spilled across the wooden floor, and for a moment, she simply stood still, taking in how completely different this space felt from the first time she had ever stepped inside it. The wedding had been small, intimate, held in the very park where Ethan had proposed, surrounded only by close family and friends who understood exactly how significant the moment truly was. Diane had cried during the ceremony, not out of grief this time, but out of genuine joy, finally able to witness her son build a future without the shadow of the past looming over every important moment. Lily had stood proudly beside Grace, grinning through her own happy tears, grateful to have played even a small part in guiding her brother toward honesty. Noah had attended too, seated comfortably among Grace's co-workers, offering a warm, genuine congratulations that carried no trace of old, unspoken hope. Their friendship remained steady and uncomplicated, exactly as it was always meant to be, a quiet reminder that sometimes the right people enter our lives simply to help us recognize what we deserve, without needing anything more for themselves. A few months after the wedding, Noah began seeing someone new, a woman he had met through a mutual friend, and he brought her along to a small gathering at Grace and Ethan's house one weekend. Watching him laugh easily with his new partner, clearly happy, clearly comfortable, Grace felt a quiet warmth settle over her, grateful that the timing of things, however complicated it had once seemed, had eventually worked out exactly as it should have for everyone involved. Diane, too, continued to soften with each passing month. She began joining Grace for occasional lunches of their own, conversations that had nothing to do with Ethan or the past, simply two women slowly getting to know each other on their own terms. She mentioned Claire far less often now, and when she did, it was with a gentle, settled fondness rather than desperate longing, the kind of remembering that no longer required anyone else to sacrifice their own place in the family to make room for it. In the months following the wedding, Ethan surprised Grace in the smallest, steadiest ways. He no longer flinched when she mentioned future plans. He spoke openly about starting a family one day, about traveling together, about building an entirely new set of memories in the home they now fully shared. There were no more locked doors between them, no more careful silences hiding difficult truths. One quiet evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun sink slowly behind the trees, Grace turned to Ethan with a thought that had been settling gently in her mind for weeks. "Do you ever think about her?" she asked softly, without any trace of jealousy or insecurity in her voice. "Claire, I mean." Ethan considered the question thoughtfully before answering. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Not the way I used to, though. Not as someone I lost everything to. Just as someone who was part of my life once, who taught me things I needed to learn, even if it took losing her, and nearly losing you, to actually understand them." "What did she teach you?" Grace asked gently. "That love isn't something you protect by holding on too tightly," Ethan said, reaching for Grace's hand. "It's something you build by choosing someone honestly, every single day, even when it's uncomfortable, even when the truth is complicated. I didn't understand that until you forced me to look at everything I was avoiding." Grace smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as the evening settled peacefully around them. "I'm glad you finally understand it now," she said. "Me too," Ethan replied. "It took jealousy to wake me up, but it took real love, yours, to actually keep me awake." They sat together quietly as darkness gathered softly around the house, no longer haunted by memories that didn't belong to either of them fully, no longer divided by a past neither of them could change. What remained instead was something simpler and far more valuable, a partnership built honestly, chosen deliberately, and strengthened by every difficult truth they had finally learned to face together. In the end, it was not the wedding, or the proposal, or even the dramatic unraveling of old secrets that defined their story most clearly. It was the quiet, steady choice they continued making every single day afterward, to remain fully present with each other, to speak honestly even when silence felt easier, and to never again allow the weight of what once was to overshadow the life they were still building, one ordinary, honest evening at a time.